Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Perspectives, where we take a look at current events through the lens of American history as seen through the lives of the presidents of the United States. In this episode, we focus on the Unitary executive theory and firing federal workers. President Donald Trump and many of his supporters are advocates for the Unitary executive theory that provides that the president has the sole power over the entire executive branch. That includes the power to fire anyone without restrictions. What is this rooted in? Well, the Constitution. It's called the vesting clause. The beginning of Article 2, Section 1 says the executive power shall be vested in a president of the United States of America. And the key for this theory are the two articles, the and a. The executive power, according to this theory, implies all executive power shall be vested in a president, a single person, subject to the grants of authorities in Article 2 and potentially any exceptions that are listed in Article 2. Now, the current administration has what many argue is the most expansive view of the Unitary executive theory in American history. We go back to, for example, Andrew Jackson, who clearly had a very expansive view on the authority of the president, more so than any other president through the end of the 19th century. In fact, Jackson once said the president was more representative of the national will than the Congress. He went further and said the opinion of the judges has no more authority over Congress than the opinion of Congress has over the judges, and on that point, the president is independent of both. The authority of the Supreme Court must not therefore be permitted to control the Congress or the executive when acting in their legislative capacities, but to have only such influence as the force of their reasoning may deserve. Pretty strong stuff coming from Andrew Jackson. But even President Jackson recognized there were some limits on his authority. For example, he realized he was not authorized to order the removal of federal funds from the Bank of the United States, which he very much wanted to do. Why? Well, there was a statute that said only the Treasury Secretary could order those removals. So what did Jackson do? Well, he wanted his Treasury Secretary to do it. He wouldn't do it. He fired him. He fired the next one. He got onto a third Treasury Secretary before the order was actually taken. The point was that even Andrew Jackson recognized that his personal authority could be limited by statute, which is contrary to the Unitary executive theory. Now, for today's episode, we're going to focus specifically on the authority to fire executive branch employees. What does the Constitution say? What have the courts said? In terms of the courts, we're going to focus on one key case that happened to be written by a Chief Justice who also was a former president, William Taft. We'll start with the Constitution. Now, part of the challenge here is the Constitution is silent on removals. Doesn't say anything in there. Clearer on appointments, we have the Appointments Clause, Article 2, Section 2, which says that he, the president, shall have power to nominate, and by and with the advice and consent of the Senate, shall appoint ambassadors, other public ministers and consuls, judges of the Supreme Court, and all other officers of the United States whose appointments are not herein otherwise provided for and which shall be established by law. But the Congress may by law vest the appointment of such inferior officers as they think proper in the president alone, in the courts of law, or in the heads of departments. And that last part is key, the authority to vest that for inferior officers, at least some of them, not in the president, but in the heads of departments. Well, for this, we need to have a discussion about, well, what are principal officers, what are inferior officers, and what are the differences? For principal officers, they are department heads, cabinet members, direct reports to the president. They are nominated by the president. They are confirmed by the Senate. Inferior officers, and there's two branches here that we're going to talk about. In some of them, that authority goes to the president to nominate, and these people are confirmed by the Senate. Some inferior officers fall into that category, but the vast majority of federal workers fall into the other category, which is that they do not require Senate confirmation. The delegation of their hiring and termination is given to department heads, not to the President of the United States. Most of these folks are covered by civil service rules. We're going to tackle each of these categories of principal and inferior officers here in the context now of the Unitary executive theory. That Supreme Court case, Myers v. U.S., 1926, so just about a century ago, Frank Myers was a postmaster in Portland, Oregon, who was fired by President Woodrow Wilson in 1920, and who was fired before his four-year term had expired. He had been hired under a statute that went back to 1876 that said postmasters of the first, second, and third classes shall be appointed and may be removed by the president by and with the advice and consent of the Senate, and shall hold their offices for 4 years unless sooner removed or suspended according to law. In this case, the Senate did not consent to the removal of Myers. He sued to get his job back, but the government actually countered, and they said, look, the government said that statute was unconstitutional. It infringed on the inherent power of the presidency, and this case went to the Supreme Court. The Taft court ruled against Myers. The vote was 6-3 along ideological lines, very much like today. You've got 6 conservatives on the court, you've got 3 progressives on the court. Among the progressives, some of the most progressive leaders of the entire era, Oliver Wendell Holmes, Brandeis, and we'll focus a little bit on the dissent, just for perspective and context of what the other side was saying at the time, beginning with Brandeis, who focused on the fact that the executive branch is not independent of the other branches. According to Brandeis, the separation of powers of government did not make each branch completely autonomous. It left each in some measure dependent upon the others. The doctrine of separation of powers was adopted not to promote efficiency, but to preclude the exercise of arbitrary power. The purpose was not to avoid friction, but by means of the inevitable friction incident to the distribution of the governmental powers among 3 departments to save the people from autocracy, the view of Brandeis. One of the other progressives on the bench at the time was James McReynolds, and he kind of parsed the different roles in his lengthy dissent of the executive and legislative branches and their authorities. According to McReynolds, the actual ouster of an officer is executive action, but to prescribe the conditions under which this may be done is legislative. The act of hanging a criminal is executive, but to say when and where and how he shall be hanged is clearly legislative. According to the dissents, Congress could impose restrictions on removals in the executive branch, which, by the way, had been the established practice for years, confirmed by many laws that had been signed by many presidents. The Taft court, though, in the majority disagreed. They declared this postmaster law unconstitutional. In fact, they went even further, but not as far as the current assertions of the unitary executive theory. Now, Taft really focused on this case. This was important to him as a former president. He spent over a year writing the opinion. He wrote it himself, extensive research, very much an originalist. He went back to the original debates in the Constitutional Convention. He talks a lot about the very first Congress. In 1789, the very first year that the Congress actually was seated, actually talked about this issue when a bill was put forward that would put limits on the president's ability to remove executive branch officials without senatorial consent. It went all the way to a tie vote in the Senate before Vice President John Adams broke that tie, and the bill actually went down to defeat. And that's been quoted going forward as authoritative, in fact, because so many of the members of Congress actually had served at the Constitutional Convention. The fact that this did not pass seemed to imply that the president should not be infringed upon when it came to the power of removal. Now, as for Taft, again, this was very important to him. He said that about the opinion in Myers, I never wrote an opinion I felt to be so important in its effect. His personal experience did influence his thinking. In his opinion, he talked about principal officers and what happens when the president, the moment he loses confidence in the intelligence, ability, judgment, or loyalty of any one of them, he must have the power to remove them without delay, just kind of what you'd expect from a former president. The ultimate conclusion was that for principal officers and those inferior officers who have been nominated by the president and confirmed by the Senate, that the fact that no express limit was placed on the power of removal by the executive was convincing indication that none was intended. In the absence of any specific provision to the contrary, the power of appointment to executive offices carries with it, as a necessary incident, the power of removal. So not only was the postmaster law unconstitutional in this case and void, they actually went further. One of the most controversial laws in American history was the Tenure of Office Act. It was used to impeach Andrew Johnson, the president, back in the 1860s. It required senatorial consent to dismiss a cabinet official. Johnson ignored that. He dismissed an official. He was impeached. According to the Taft court in Myers, the Tenure of Office Act had been unconstitutional all along. There's a bold, decisive power confirmed for the presidency in this decision that's consistent with the unitary executive theory, and it has stood for the last 100 years. Now, we recognize that there's been some disagreements of whether or not this decision extends to the leaders of independent agencies. And there was a case about a decade later, the mid-1930s, Humphrey's executive Executor v. U.S. that actually narrowed the Taft decision when it came to the leaders of these independent agencies, as the court at the time determined that some of these independent agencies actually had quasi-legislative and judicial powers, and so that was different, and therefore Congress could impose some restrictions. That's still controversial to today, so the current Supreme Court has been looking at this, and so we'll set that aside for a moment in terms of how these powers apply to these independent agencies. But in general, for the cabinet agencies, principal officials and inferior officials who have been confirmed by the Senate, that the Congress cannot impose any restrictions on the power for the president to remove, which again, consistent with the unitary executive theory. But what about inferior officials who are not confirmed by the Senate, which actually represents the vast majority of civil servants who have been protected from summary dismissal ever since the Pendleton Act was first passed in 1883 and has been grown upon ever since? Now, at the very end of the opinion in the Myers case, the very end, the last couple of pages, Chief Justice Taft actually addresses this. And in it, he affirmed the power that to remove these civil servants is different. He links back to that appointments clause that we talked about earlier, where Congress can vest the power of appointment in the heads of departments, again, separate from the president. And this, in the Myers decision, Taft quoted another decision going back to U.S. v. Perkins. This is 1886. According to that decision, we have no doubt that when Congress by law vests the appointment of inferior officers in the heads of departments, it may limit and restrict the power of removal, as it deems best for the public interest. The constitutional authority in Congress to thus vest the appointment implies authority to limit, restrict, and regulate the removal by such laws as Congress may enact in relation to the officers so appointed. And Will Taft, in the decision in Myers, agrees with this. He specifically says that the decision in Myers has nothing to do with protections for civil servants. In fact, he wrote, "An argument has been made against our inclusion in favor of the executive power of removal by the president without the consent of the Senate, that it will open the door to a reintroduction of the spoils system. The evil of the spoils system aimed at in the civil service law and its amendments is in respect of inferior offices. The classified service now includes a vast majority of all the civil officers. The independent power of removal by the president alone for principal officers and inferior officers confirmed by the Senate under present conditions works no practical interference with the merit system." And this is a critical distinction. For Taft, and his unique perspective, coming again from a former president and sitting as the Chief Justice in his conservative court, they came up with really two major elements here. The major one, the one that was the primary focus of the opinion, sanction the authority, the complete authority of the President of the United States to dismiss any officers that he has appointed and have been confirmed by the Senate. That's consistent with the unitary executive theory. But at the same time, at the end of the Myers decision, Chief Justice Taft confirms that Congress can place limits on the president's ability to remove civil servants whose appointments were entrusted to the heads of departments, which again is the vast majority of civil servants. For those, you got to follow the rules and any restrictions that have been posed by the Congress. This is counter to the unitary executive theory, both elements of the decision in Myers. Now look, others may disagree about this because there have been disagreements about this all the way since the beginning of the Republic. But who better to listen to on this particular topic than the one person, the only person in the history of the country who had served as both a President of the United States and a Chief Justice, William Howard Taft? I put my money on him on this particular case. That's a look at the unitary executive theory and firing federal workers. For more on some of these stories, check out the links in the description below, links to some other videos from Presidential Chronicles. You can also check out my books on Amazon.com. Don't forget to subscribe to this channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher. This is Presidential Perspectives from Presidential Chronicles.